Hi students, today what we're going to talk about is Alexander and some of the different sources that we have on Alexander. Alexander is a very interesting figure in history because of the writers that we have during his time and how the ancient writers after his period use those sources to develop their own histories. And we have some loss of information throughout, which makes it quite interesting to look at how these sources are connected and the gaps in our knowledge as well. As we go through, you should obviously return to some of these discussion questions. So the differences between primary and secondary sources, and the idea that ancient sources themselves can be secondary. Sometimes, earlier on in history, we've had a fairly simplistic approach. If it's from the ancient period, it's regarded as a primary source. But, the way in which being in the period and at the time and witnessing the campaigns of Alexander is very, very important when we look at the reliability of certain sources. As I've mentioned with Alexander before, is the idea that he is a multifaceted character, and that is due to the sources that we have on him. Arrian really puts it very clearly in his preface, saying that there is no person who we have more variance in the sources than Alexander. Maybe a bit of an overstatement, but definitely highlights the differences between different sources. An overview of the key issues that we have on the sources of Alexander, and there are many more, but these are some of the key ones. We have 3 centuries between the death of Alexander and the first full narrative of his reign, which is Arrian. So there's a huge amount of information that's lost in that period of time. The contemporary sources, so the people who are writing when Alexander is alive, a lot of those sources are now lost. Okay, the fragments that we do have are very brief, and even the citations in later secondary sources are not always referred back to. Secondary sources are contractions, so simplifications of expansive earlier primary works. Diodorus and Justin, tend to abridge certain aspects of Alexander's life because their works are in huge proportion. And contemporary sources, so the court historians, who are the people who are traveling with Alexander, are prone to exaggeration of Alexander's flaws and his successes, and prone to embellishment of themselves as well and their role in the campaigns. So some of the key writers that we're going to talk about, and we're not going to talk about all of them, but we're going to talk about some key ones, are listed here. These are some sources that you might like to use when you're going and having a look at the different images and interpretations of Alexander. You should definitely return back to these key writers of the time. Because Alexander, we have these 2 kind of periods of history when historians are writing about Alexander. We have the contemporary sources that you see up here, so Nearchus, Ptolemy, Aristobulus, and Clearchus, and the way in which later ancient writers use those sources to develop their own histories. Again, they're Arrian, Plutarch, Curtius Rufus, Diodorus, and Trogus, or Justin. And this spawns what is known as the Vulgate tradition, this use of earlier sources to develop later historical works. And Arrian, Plutarch, Curtius Rufus, Diodorus Siculus, and Justin are all regarded as secondary sources because they were not alive during the period of Alexander. The earlier sources are living during the time or directly just after Alexander. Bit of an overview of each of the sources. We're going to go into some more detail though regarding each of these. A lot of these contemporary sources are people who Alexander goes on campaign with. So you can think about the role in which they have as participants on his campaign and how that may be both a valuable addition to their works and also maybe perhaps a limitation as well. Secondary sources, some of them we've looked at these before, and as I said, Diodorus Siculus' mammoth work, Justin, Quintius Curtius Rufus, Arrian and his Anabasis, and Plutarch as well. So we've got a bit of an overview. They're the kind of court historians. They are Callisthenes, Ptolemy, and Aristobulus. And as I said before, prone to embellishment and exaggeration. So exaggerate their own roles and achievements when on campaign with Alexander, and in the process embellishing those of Alexander for their own, as well as for their own sake as well. So they embellish not only Alexander, but also their own kind of deeds during the period of time. So Callisthenes, okay, he's the official court historian from the beginning of the campaign in Asia till his death in 327. He wrote the Deeds of Alexander, okay, giving a first-hand narrative of the events down to 330. There's very limited references and citations back to him in later works, despite being the first historian. He's very heavily criticized by later historians such as Polybius in his account for the Battle of Gaugamela for exaggerating Persian numbers, and this idea of this usualistic bias, okay, trying to build Alexander up to more than what he is. He was also attacked later on his account for the journey of Siwa, regarding whether it was like ravens or serpents that showed Alexander the way to Siwa, and later historians really attack Callisthenes. So whether he can be regarded as a worthy source or not is questionable. On Onesicritus, he wrote in the early period of the successes. He did accompany Alexander on his campaign, so the successes is the period after the death of Alexander. There's this great sort of beef that Nearchus has with Onesicritus, okay, and that they may have shared the helm, but we have other sources that suggest that he was below Alexander, so there was below Nearchus, so a bit of a clash there of Alexander's generals. He wrote how Alexander was educated, and trying to imitate the style of Xenophon, who was imitated by later historians as well. So you can see the importance of Xenophon's work, and he focuses particularly on Alexander's work in India. He was the first to give authors on the details of their travels past Sri Lanka as well. Nearchus. So he's born in Crete. However, he moves to Amphipolis, and he's actually sent to be educated in Pella with Alexander. So you can see Nearchus is a very, very close friend of Alexander. He actually gets banished by Philip in 337 because he advises Alexander to challenge Philip when Philip is arranging a marriage for Alexander's older brother, Aridaeus, and Alexander feels a bit left out. He says, "Why are you not marrying me? Do you not think of me as your first, your heir to the throne? Should I not be married?" And because he's not a wife suitable of Alexander, and Philip banishes all of his friends to get rid of their bad influence. He took part later on in the Sogdian campaign, and his account from South India to Susa at the end of the campaign is a basis for Arrian's later work. Nearchus describes Onesicritus as a fool, okay, and there's again this competition between Nearchus and Onesicritus. Aristobulus served again with the king as a minor officer. He's writing around 301, apparently, and again indicated in antiquity as a flatterer, to apparently give a eulogistic portrait of Alexander. He's got lots of falsehoods. He says that Callisthenes actually conspired and repeatedly denies Alexander predilection for strong drink. So, we have a lot of these falsehoods being repeated in histories of Alexander, which makes it difficult for later secondary sources to build accurate representations of who Alexander really is. And we can try to piece that together by contrasting later work. So we can think about events such as the Gordian Knot and contrasting that with other sources to try to build a version of the past which corroborates and is supported by multiple sources to try to build a more accurate representation. He does give some valuable chronological data when looking at the Indian campaign, and he does record the wealth of geographical and botanical detail during those campaigns as well. Ptolemy, he claims to be the half-brother of Alexander. He tries to link himself to the Argenaid dynasty. This may be because Ptolemy himself later becomes the ruler of Egypt when the empire of Alexander breaks down. So he's trying to give him some sense and some legitimization back to Alexander as a valuable king. He served with Alexander from his first campaigns, one of the bodyguards, and his role in the battle of the Issus is really can see a sense of his own embellishment of his own role in the battle. He does try to inflate his great deeds. His history of Alexander was published around 310 to 301. Okay, has since been lost. Okay, like many of the earlier sources, but is preserved in Arrian, Plutarch, and Curtius Rufus. Okay, he may have used Callisthenes as a source as well. So we have other works from around the same period using earlier historians to build their own interpretation. So Clearchus is writing directly after the death of Alexander. He is one of the most widely read, early historians of the Alexander, and he gives rise to this Vulgate tradition. Pliny calls him a celebrated writer, and his account is most likely published before 301, and probably appeared, before Ptolemy's account. We know that Ptolemy uses Clearchus as a source. Tarn suggests later, he offers a different perspective, saying that Aristobulus, that he borrowed from Aristobulus, and actually he wrote later on in 280. He's believed to have read all of the earlier Alexander historians, the ones that we've just talked about, and his work, although it has been lost, has been suggested by Bosworth to have a taste for the tawdry and colourful, predilection for sensationalism, preoccupation for rhetoric, which encouraged exaggeration, and preferred imaginative fiction to sober truth. So you get this idea that he really wants to make his story memorable and exciting, and wants to focus on the interesting aspects of Alexander, which is the drink, which is the women, which is the court, which is the grandeur. He really wants to build these aspects up. And he is to be the source of this Vulgate tradition, and we do see Curtius Rufus and Arrian and Justin using him heavily in their later works. So looking at these later ancient historians now, Theodorus Siculus, he writes a mammoth work of 40 books, his universal history of the period. He's based his chapters, which deal with Alexander, on Clearchus, and therefore inherited the biases as well. He spends unproportional amounts of time on certain topics, and again, an eye for the sensational and favorite themes, similar to Clearchus as well. He's very much criticized by later historians such as Mosman and Schwartz as being an uncritical maker of excerpts, and he's kind of criticized for not really developing his own interpretation of history, but instead offering only a collection of different summaries. Pompeius Trogus, his work has been lost, but it's actually preserved in Justin, who writes a kind of a summary of his work. His focus is on ethnographical and geographical digressions, so about the people and about the land in which the Alexander is traveling through. He's uncertain regarding methodology, potentially consulted a wider range of primary sources, but we really only have Justin's paraphrasing to go off for this. On to Justin, he's been sort of very heavily criticized, but Heckler and Yardley actually try to build him up and support him a bit, saying that one could learn a good deal about the popular Alexander tradition from comparing Justin's epitome with other works, so maybe not useful as a source in terms of giving us an accurate representation of Alexander, but useful for historiographical kind of reference. And he, again, uses Pompeius Trogus as his summary. Plutarch is obviously a very, very interesting source because he is actually not a historian. He thinks of himself as a biographer, trying to peer into the eyes and the souls of men to bring out their true values and morals, and this ethical kind of dimension to Plutarch's work makes it very interesting. He is a Greek writing during the Roman period. He uses an eclectic use of sources. He uses narrative based on Clearchus and Arrian, it appears. Plutarch is very, very focused on characteristics, qualities, and the morals. So you can see some of the things that he really tries to focus on in his history. He, most importantly, his parallel lives in which Alexander is one. Alexander is compared to Julius Caesar. Okay, and he looks at the virtues and vices of certain men and tries to offer the people of Rome who are reading his histories a bit of an educational guidebook about the great figures of both Greece and Rome, and how people should live. His methodology, as I mentioned before, is not a history, it is a biography. It's not a recollection of the past, okay? It tries to delve deeper than that and focus on an analysis of the person. Again, his works are comparative, and he really focuses on this idea of self-improvement and the importance of learning from the past. Arrian is probably regarded as the most sort of notable of sources, and his methodology is definitely regarded quite highly by later historians. He is accused of whitewashing Alexander, okay, trying to present a sort of overly positive view of Alexander, but his works are modelled on Xenophon. You can see again the importance of him, and Haeckel and Lally sort of state that his focus of his works is definitely on the military. So these are some of his works, and his Anabasis, okay, or the Campaigns of Alexander, also called him modern works. There's 7 books from his ascension to his death. We also have the Affairs of Alexander, the Indica, which is based on the Arcus, and Bosworth regards it as the most complete and most sober account of Alexander's reign. Arrian has the benefit of drawing on multiple different sources to develop a the most reliable version of Alexander. And most importantly, we have this excerpt in the preface, which you should pause the video now and read. As you're doing that, you can see how the Vulgate tradition develops and the decisions that historians have to make in order to make sure that their work is reliable and accurate. This is a really important element of historical evaluation of sources, and you can see there's some of the things that we do in history today, which is foregrounded in this excerpt. Lastly, Quintius Curtius Rufus, another Roman historian, okay, author of the History of Alexander. His main source is Clearchus, okay, potentially also used Ptolemy as well. It's a rhetorical work where the idea that Alexander is corrupted by fortune. Okay, he really, again, similar to Plutarch, tries to focus on the morals and the ethics of the time. He does appear to have read Clearchus and Trogus, okay, so makes again similar mistakes to what they make, and it's highly subjective work. Other sources that we do have all the time, we obviously have inscriptions from Alexander, we have coinage, which is very, very important, and then we have elements of archaeological evidence as well. So you can think about the differences that these physical pieces of evidence provide and how they differ to that of literary sources. As we go through looking at Alexander, hopefully you can help to develop an answer to this question regarding the differences between literary and more physical types of evidence. And as we started in the beginning with Arrian and the multiplicity of different interpretations of Alexander, I'm going to finish with another quote that looks at the way in which Alexander and the versions of him shift and change over time. And the problems of the sources is the fact that the individual will always tune into the harmony of the voice that he or she finds plausible and pleasing. So I encourage you to be critical historians and not let a particular view of Alexander which you enjoy or that you connect with or that you find highly interesting to sway your version of Alexander, and always look at the sources with a very critical eye.